Yeah.
Hi, Michael.
Hi, Jordy. Good to see you.
Good to see you too. Thank you for taking your time and explaining for us about the globalization and what it has to do with the film industry.
Yep. Excited
S-
too.
I've heard you were in the film production work, right?
Correct. Yes, I founded my production company here in Los Angeles called Graham Entertainment. I also have a production company with some London producing partners called Interstellar Entertainment, where I did the Michael Mann movie Ferrari, and we also have a horror comedy creature feature called Ick that was at the Toronto Film Festival. And I also do some science docu-series with some producing partners in Uruguay. They're based in Montevideo. And then working with some screenwriters from Germany, doing some German Chinese TV series, German Chinese, or actually US Chinese film and animation. So we're developing some projects right now. So very much it's a cross. I love doing cross language, cross cultural, cross country productions, whether it's film or TV.
Wow, like that's really amazing. So you just mentioned China and UK and Germany and all those countries, and which one of those would you say has the biggest influence on the film industry?
It's really interesting because the US still, due to Hollywood, is the biggest film industry. Just on purely like soft power impact. It doesn't mean that there aren't great local films and everything from UK, Germany, Mexico, Korea, Japan, and so on, and particularly even China. But there isn't really one country that has that dominance where stories from one country get seen by the rest of the world, right? Like Hollywood has always been good at that for the last over 100 years. A story in the US, you can actually show it in Germany, France, in general. These are generalizations. Um, I know China, for example, you bring up China, they they actually have a huge film industry, and they're actually one of their films, Neza 2, which actually is a really fun film. It's an animation film. It was one of the largest box office films in the world ever. And people said, "Oh my gosh, it's showing China's dominance, in storytelling around the world." However, the majority of that box office of that Chinese animation state was all in China and maybe some Southeast Asia. They kept saying, "Oh, there's going to be dominance and it's going to go to Hollywood," but it was such a small percentage of box office here or even in the Western countries, like in Europe, that it's still a very localized. State what's made in China stays in China. And they want to have a soft power. China wants to do what Hollywood does is say, we'll tell Chinese stories so the rest of the world sees it. But there's very, very, very few examples of where that's happened. It doesn't mean it may happen, but it hasn't happened really yet, to the same extent that you see, the way Hollywood does.
And would you say Hollywood should be considered, I don't know, concerned about China's success in the movie industry?
It would, well, in general, everyone wants to see good stories put out there, regardless around the world, right? I think the issue you're seeing some geopolitics playing where, China says only this number of movies are allowed in China, right? You don't have that in the US and in most parts of the world, most. There's always countries that put limits on how many movies outside a country can go into their own. But in general, we don't have that. It's a very purely capitalistic, like it does well, money wise, it does well story wise. People want it. You can do it here in the US, and I'm assuming it's also the same in Germany. Now, China, they actually do put, quotas on the number of films that are allowed from outside of China. It doesn't even matter US, it even applies to Japan and Europe and so on. They've tightened it up. It's always been there, for the last at least 12 plus years. But it's might be getting a little bit tighter, but it's always been there, and I think that's where Hollywood feels it's unfair, on that part. However, hopefully there are more stories that could be told around the world. Hopefully China creates better movies that get seen, because then more people want to go to the movies to see it, but that hasn't been the case yet.
How do you define a good marketing strategy?
I love that question because that's what I did most of my career with, marketing movies from the US to the rest of the world, or we took movies from the rest of the world and brought it to the US or other parts of it. A good strategy is understanding what the movie is about and finding those best parts to get people excited about it, right? And there's two ways you do that. You want to make sure that there's awareness. So the goal is to make sure people are aware about a movie, right? So how do you target to the widest audience that would do it? And once they're aware, you want to make sure they're interested in it, right? So it's awareness and interest, right? You can't be interested in something unless you know about it. So the awareness. But if you're aware about it, you might know about it. But Jordy, like you've seen certain trailers, movies, and you're like, oh, I know about it, but there's no way I'm going to pay a movie ticket, because it doesn't interest me, right? So that's the two parts of the Holy Grail of marketing, is making people aware and then making them, those who are aware, that are interested in it, And the key part is, how do you target who's the right people to make aware about it, right? And that one is I would say, more of the data oriented part. Like, you're going to go after younger males who love horror, right? So then you have to make sure what social media platforms are they on? What type of sites do they listen to? Which podcasts do they go to? It's like, where do they live, right? Do you want to even do billboards, right? And so you have to kind of figure out from a pure data research perspective. It's a lot of data oriented, of trying to figure out what's the best way to go about it. Then there's the art about it, the creative. Like, okay, so how do you take this 2-hour movie and make it into a 2-minute trailer? Or how do you take these images and put it, and capture the essence in a poster or a digital post or through publicity unit photography? So that is kind of where you're trying to mix the data oriented with the arts aspect of it, the creative aspect of it, and then you mix the creative. Sometimes you'll test trailers with target audiences, and you'll sit through many of these where you show trailers, you show posters, you even show movies, right? And then you ask them, what do they think about it? And you have to figure out what's the best way to do it, and then every country is different. If you look at movie posters, very often are different in Europe than they are in US than in Asia, and particularly Japan. Japan is always like Mars to me. They always do different posters every single time. And if you ever go to the movie database and go into pick a movie and pick the media section, they break down all posters by country and language, and you get to see a really interesting examples of how it's done around the world, and that's where they target, the specifics of the art, the art part of it, towards the audience.
We all hope for good luck.
Buy a movie ticket.
I will. And the others will too.